Welcome to the Temple of Geek Podcast. My name is Monica. I will be your host today as we discuss Season 1 of Miss Marvel. If this is your first time tuning into the Temple of Geek Podcast, welcome. The Temple of Geek Podcast has been around since 2012 and is hosted by a variety of geeks from the Temple of Geek team. Here we cover all manner of geek, pop culture, news, and events. To our returning listeners, thank you again for tuning in. We really appreciate you being here. With me today are returning podcast guests, Maria and Kristen. They're here to talk about Miss Marvel Season 1, and they were here earlier talking about the first 2 episodes with us. So welcome to the podcast. Can you please introduce yourselves to our listeners and tell them a little bit about you?
Hi, my name is Maria. You may know me as Call Me by this name, Maria. I'm usually on TikTok is the best way to find me. I usually do a lot of television and fandom content, but for the past 8 weeks, it's probably just been straight Miss Marvel content. So if you were interested in following me, please find me on TikTok. But it's been a lot of fun discussing the show and for different levels. So I'm really excited to be back.
And I'm Kristen Chavez. I am a contributor and sometimes Temple of Geek podcast host and guest on the show. So I'm so glad to be back. Also a big Miss Marvel fan when the comics. So when the show came out, I was just so excited and so glad to talk to you both a few weeks ago. And I'm glad that we're bringing it back full circle.
Absolutely. And just to preface for our audience out there, the 3 of us are big Miss Marvel fans. So for the most part, we will be discussing how much we loved Miss Marvel, as we did in our recent episode. But we also want to talk about the disconnect that Miss Marvel has. So if you're somebody who didn't really understand the hype around Miss Marvel, if you didn't get it, if you weren't connected, maybe hearing our perspectives may kind of give you a little bit more insight as to why some people really enjoyed it. And so we're going to talk about some of the reasons that people have said that they didn't enjoy it. So we'll get into all of that, storyline, character breakdowns, all that kind of stuff throughout this episode. But in the meantime, first off, before we get into all the breakdowns, can the 2 of you just kind of give me your general overall, just a general overall review of what you thought of Season 1 of Miss Marvel?
Marvelous.
Yeah, I loved it. Marvelous is perfect word for it. I loved everything about it. I cannot stop praising. I will probably never stop praising the show.
Yeah, it was just so good. Just enjoyable to watch and to see the actors and the characters and their journeys and progressions. I think a lot of the beats just hit really well. I just when it ended, all I wanted was 15 more episodes.
I really hope there's a season 2.
I cannot wait a year.
Yeah, I really need them to sign a season 2 right away. I cannot wait for the Marvels. I need something right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we got to the very spoiler warning for Miss Marvel.
Yeah. Oh yeah,
I think that might have been
it's been spoiled.
This is your last chance to leave.
Yeah.
Get out.
Do not pass
but when we got to that final scene, my main takeaway was, hurry, I need the Marvels. I can't believe I have to wait this long. And I just...
The end credit scene or the final scene? Because there's 2 reveals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wait, there was...
Do you mean the end credits?
Yeah, the other...
Yeah, the end credit scene, right?
Yeah. We're talking about...
The mid-credit, with Carol.
We already gave the spoiler warning, so we could just say what it
with
is.
Carol. With Carol, right? We were talking about Carol. Yeah, because there's the memes as well, so there's a lot
and
of...
then the
yeah, so I wasn't sure which one we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm sure later on, but so we're all clearly on the same page.
I was like, did I miss something? No, okay, yeah, no, Carol. Okay. When I saw Carol Danvers, Brie Larson in her bedroom, I was like, I can't believe it. I need something now. I want the Marvels. Overall, I loved the show. I smiled all the way through the show except episode 5, which I sobbed through. But overall, I thought it was a great show. I thought it was beautiful for a million different reasons, and we will talk about those reasons now. So my first question for you guys is, what did you think of her as a superhero?
So like with her powers or just like in general? Because I loved her character a lot.
Let's talk about this
Yeah.
character of Miss Marvel as a superhero.
Like incredible and amazing. I was actually just like thinking about how amazing it is, the fact that she's like the first female superhero that's so well developed and completely developed, and she like stood on her own. There was no like sidekick or male counterpart that was already in the MCU. Like even Carol Danvers had Nick Fury. So like, and she held her own. Like she was a good standalone character. I cannot get over Iman Vellani's like acting, for one thing. This was her first role. I cannot get over that this was her first role. Like she is Kamala Khan to me. But I think the character was so well developed. I think that every episode was able to capture every part of her identity, what she was going through. We got a sense of knowing her family, her community. And then you were able to see her grow and develop and change and get used to her powers and get stronger with her powers with every like episode, because every fight scene like brought something new. And I really loved that. Like from the first episode or the second episode where she drops the kid, to the wedding, to the cute little meet cute with Kareem, to the end like finale fight scene where she like goes ambiguous. It's just, you could just see the growth. So overall, one of like the best developed characters, and one of the strongest characters I think that exists in the MCU too.
Yeah, because she really, I love that you mentioned that, and I hadn't thought of it in that way. That, you know, she is really working on herself. Yes, she has that training montage with Bruno early on and stuff, but it's still like she's really coming into her own. And a lot of it is she also has to find herself within all of that, whether it's, you know, being a clandestine, whether it's being a 16-year-old girl who just wants to learn how to drive from the cute new guy in town. And just like, and even the little things with like her friends that, you know, she was devastated and terrified that Nakia found out and might hate her, you know. And I think for me, I'm just like kind of a sucker for all of that. Like, I think in this corner, there's a little Sailor Moon that I grew up with. And it's that, you know, that magical girl when you're in, you know, balancing like middle or high school and saving the world at night, that, it's really fun to have that, the coming of age coming of, you know, superheroes and superpowers and learning to deal with that I think, I totally agree. Iman Vellani just nailed it. Like, you know, first time, like right away, that I can't wait for more of her, of Miss Marvel, whatever shape they come in. Like, I want it.
More of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the things that as I watched the series, I kept thinking, look at this first generation superhero. And I kept thinking it over and over. And that's something I hadn't thought about like before coming up to it. But the more I watched it, the more I was like, wow, this is kind of a really good representation of what would happen with a first generation superhero. Obviously in the cookie cutter world of like Marvel, and not like the more realistic world of like The Boys or something like that, right? But in this sweet MCU,
don't let her near the boys. Yeah. I don't want.
And like
she needs to be safe and protected.
Yeah, they would not.
But one of the things, yeah, and one of the things that I kept thinking was like, wow, like there is no way that a first generation kid, you know, would be able to get away with being a superhero at night and their parents not know about it. Like it just would not happen. Like, you know, maybe in other family dynamics, you can have a parent who's not overly protective of their little child, you know, but from just sneaking out to AvengerCon, she was going to get caught. There was no way she was going to get away with that. She was going to get caught. So the first time that I started kind of really realizing like, wow, this is like a first generation family story too. And that's so relatable for me as a first generation kid, you know, and well, adult now. Right. But, you know, I just loved how real Miss Marvel felt. I loved how much her family influenced the type of hero that she is. And I loved that her friends were also like influencing the type of hero that she is. You know, I agree with you, Mario, when you were saying that, you know, this is a very well-developed character and you see the full storyline. I love that there's not like all this lying and hiding. Yes, obviously, like they're not telling everybody, hey, guess what? I have all these powers. But I love that between the family and the friends, there's not all this lying. You know, did people find out at different times? Blah, blah, blah. Yes. But nobody's like out there just kind of like lying and keeping secrets. And as far as superhero story goes, that's more appealing to me.
And talking about like the disconnect that we felt with other people, a lot of people have said like, oh, it's like a played out story, or you know where it's going. And I don't feel that way at all, because like usually superhero stories are hiding your identity, not telling the community. Like you're in if you compare this to Spider-Man, which is also a really great coming of age story as a superhero that we can all relate to, he had to hide his identity and eventually could tell Aunt May, and that was a whole moment. And same with telling MJ. But with Kamala Khan, her superhero-dom is so heavy influenced by the community and her friends and her family. And it's just really beautiful that like we don't have a moment of trauma or tragedy. Like there is trauma, but it's not conditioned to her superhero-dom. Like it doesn't make her the hero. Like she didn't have to lose someone to be the hero she's supposed to be. She had to she got closer to her mother to be the superhero that she's supposed to be. And it's just really beautiful that like coming together created this character rather than like a usual like plot device trope. And I really love that they emphasize that, especially in the finale when Jersey came together and like protected her.
Yes.
And then speaking from like the Pakistani side, like I know that with my mother being first generation as well, I remember thinking like, oh, there was no way I could do this. But I realized like with time that the more I told my mother, the better I was at something. So like, I'm really happy that they emphasize that her relationship with her mother really strengthens her superhero-dom. And I just love that this exists for like the next generation of like girls growing up. It's just so incredible that they get to see this growing up.
I think it's really interesting. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think it's really interesting that you both are mentioning like the first generation experience, which I can't speak to, and I would love to hear more on your thoughts about this. But also harkening back to how, she doesn't have her own Nick Fury. She doesn't have, even Spider-Man had Tony, so it's like everyone had a mentor. And even with Kate Bishop, eventually she, Clint had to help her out, and Kamala was just her and Bruno and Kareem, and so I'm wondering if that was like an intentional thing on their part of the like kind of needing to figure out her space on her own, and and how does that maybe speak to the first generation experience? I'm kind of just curious about your thoughts on that and how it maybe translates into, having that mentor of a superhero when you're kind of that next generation sort of thing.
I didn't think of it that way, but that it could be definitely that way. I really like that her own superhero knowledge is what helped her, because like she was just like a fan. So she just like knew things because she was a fan. And I think that because that she drew so heavily from her community and her Muslim community and then her family background, that was like kind of her mentor essentially, like all the aspects of her that like usually would have been, I don't know, like I guess like this is where the representation of the show worked so beautifully, was that usually things that would have been like a joke or like just kind of like there for like to be there, they used it to be like her mentor and her growth and like to show like how that relationship is a big part of the person. So I guess like that's, and which is part of the immigrant experience as well. So maybe that's how they utilize it. I haven't just going off thinking about it for the first time.
Yeah.
And then speaking of like the disconnect, right? One of the things that people have repeatedly told me personally, and this isn't the internet in general, but just conversations that I've had with people.
That's why you get yourself an echo chamber, Monica.
Do you not have that? Do we not have that?
No, I have heard nothing bad about this.
Oh my God, you're so lucky.
Well, and that's
also
really
finals, so that could be why.
That's probably
No,
that is a really great point that you bring up, Kristen, and I really want to talk about that actually first, is the echo chamber, right? So I am somebody who, I run Temple of Geek as editor-in-chief. I have a lot of, things that I do. And one of the things that before I start writing something is I don't listen to anybody else's review before I put mine on paper because I want it to be like mine and not influenced by anybody, right? Yeah. But another thing that happens is that when I do start to like compare my review to other people's, usually I try to look at it in a way as like, they changed my point of view on this subject because I hadn't seen it that way. And it's not one of those, like, I have to defend my point to the end.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm willing to accept, like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, I didn't see it that way. Oh, that could be. And then there are situations where I'm like, no, I'm going to stick to my guns on this point. But usually I try to, like, kind of mute all other influences while I'm processing how I'm feeling. And my feelings on things really do change. So sometimes I see a lot of creators get some hate because their initial thing that they put out before anybody else saw it didn't connect with people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they change their mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, okay, I get that. I understand that. And then there's also creators who just love the clicks and who will say things just to get the engagement and just to get the discourse, because that's what's going to keep them popular. That's what's going to get them seen. And for some people, the validation that they get is just the comment and likes and discourse engagement. And it's not about whether they're liked or not liked. It's just like they need the validation of clicks and likes and people like blowing up their phones, right? And so I can see both sides, changing your opinion, swapping back and forth because you've gotten like feedback or you've had discussions that have changed your mind. That's great. And so I think it's important to kind of note those things before we start talking about like the disconnect and stuff. But one of the things that most people have told me is that they did not feel like it was anything or it led anywhere. Right? Like that's the main thing that people have said, like, oh, is this one little contained story and it didn't tie into anything else? And those were the issues that they were having with all these other shows or whatever. And I think that in those situations, a lot of the time it's because fans who are younger, and when I say younger, I mean like 20s below, right? They grew up on these stories. They were 10, 11, however old, and they have transitioned into adulthood with these stories. And in the most formative years, their teen years and their like, early 20s, they have remembered things like Endgame. They've remembered things like, the big movies. We have Multiverse of Madness, Spider-Man Far From Home, where all these like super epic things were happening. And then suddenly we're rebooting, starting over, and they don't remember the early years where nothing really connected.
And that's an argument for Phase 4 in general that I've heard by like every project. So this is definitely like a running theme, an argument for sure. That I've heard.
Yeah, and I absolutely get the fact that all of these fans are suddenly like, nothing's connecting for me. And that's what I don't like, because they thrive off that like high of Easter egg. Oh, this is this, and getting like that emotion. But like I was in my mid 20s in 2008 when we got our first Iron Man movie. And, following that, we didn't hear a Thanos reference until 2012, I think, when the first Avengers movie, and that was just an end credit scene. And that was nothing. But before that, we had Captain America, we had Thor, we had Iron Man 2, we had the Incredible Hulk. And none of those really connected outside of a SHIELD agent, whether it was Coulson or Nick Fury coming in and say, hey, here's the Avengers initiative we want to talk to you about. But nothing was, you had some talk about Infinity Stones, but it wasn't really going anywhere. We really thought the big baddies were going to be the 10 rings. We really thought Loki was like the big baddie we were worried about. And the Tesseract was the big thing, but nothing was connecting us in a way that we got in Endgame and Infinity War.
And I think that this is also because like the MCU was like too good at being the MCU, because like since we all remember the beginning of Phase 1, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but they didn't really have a plan for Thanos until I think Phase 2. Like they didn't decide to make Thanos because everyone was so hyped from the end credit scene of seeing Thanos. I think that's when they're like, okay, let's make Thanos the big bad. From what I remember, the MCU started because like all of their popular superheroes were bought out by other companies. The MCU only had their least lesser known ones, and they're like, okay, how do we get people? Well, they needed to make money, so they're like, how do we get people to care about these characters? So they spent all this time investing in all those characters, making like a 3-part trilogy for all of these characters, making these standalone movies. So we that's how I remember the MCU. It's like they made me like Iron Man. They made me care about Iron Man. I was introduced to Captain America for the first time with this from the MCU, and then Thanos came. So like it's definitely like they don't remember like how it was. Like they don't remember that it started out building a relationship with the characters, and they just know the Thanos of it all, which came definitely secondary. And I think that was also like an afterthought. Like after they established the characters, like okay, now let's build a story. So I don't think they know that the MCU does this really well, as this is like what the MCU can do, and they do it really well.
And productions have to shift, right? They have to respond to, again, it is at the end of the day an entertainment company. It is a business. It has to make money. That is a whole other podcast. But along those lines, and I think especially within streaming, we do also have to keep in mind, not everyone who is going to go see the movies has a Disney Plus. And I think like ideally Disney would love, right, for you to have like to be cross-platformed on everything. But at the same time, I think the majority, there's still a good chunk of people that go see movies that are not the huge MCU super fans. It's like we are the ones that are like going to go and rewatch it and everything. But you also need to get like, my parents who don't watch a lot, but they're like, oh yeah, we like that. Like, yeah, we'll check it out. We want to have a good evening, And I think that's something that you have to remember, that in some ways that, yes, if these shows do feel a little disconnected right now, they kind of have to be, because you can't go into, at the same time, the Marvels, when that movie comes out, it still needs to be accessible enough for everyone who did not see Miss Marvel or see WandaVision. So I think that's also important. Like to a degree, yes, it is. They do need to feel self-contained. They do need to have a story and complete on its own, the way that an episode of TV has to be. The way that the whole series as a whole kind of has to be. But it's one of those, in terms of it not being like fully connected, I was like, you see the threads, it does connect to this wider universe. It is the MCU. We call it universe for a reason, that there are these threads that connect and weave through, but whether or not it still needs to be broad enough for people of different audiences just to come in for whatever, because the people that like Miss Marvel may not go see the other movies. They may not care, and that's fine. And so I think that's another thing too, that yes, I can see on some level why, people might say that it feels disconnected or they don't feel that connection. I push back a little bit because it's like, no, they are connected. They are. But at the same time, acknowledging that it does need to be self-contained in a way, along with all the other movies. But I think you make a fantastic point that it's like, we are still in the building phase. We call it phase 4, but I feel like it's like phase 4, but like phase 2 of like the overall thing, like we're building up to another Thanos.
It's like a part 2, phase 1 of that.
Yeah.
But like, I appreciate like you bringing this up though, Monica, because like this is just like an overall general atmosphere with the MCU lately. I feel like I've heard the opposite, which is the fact that like, it wasn't like, it just, what was the opposite? I've heard more so that like the arguments that I've heard, the reason why they don't like Miss Marvel just don't stay consistent. So I think the disconnect isn't the MCU. I think there's a disconnect with what the fandom wants and is looking for. Because like you said, like there's a younger audience that has seen the Thanos and the Infinity Stone storyline. There's us who's known it from the beginning. But then there's also like, a new audience that is like hearing these stories for the first time, so they want to see themselves on the screen. And then there's like an unfortunate backdrop to this that is just like looking for clout and saying certain things. And not to get into that too much, but I think the biggest importance, because you brought up the back and forth and like learning and understanding that, okay, maybe your review is different, so you like, change it. That's completely okay. I think it's the willingness to have that discourse and discussion is just not there. At least I haven't seen it. Like people are very adamant. They say a comment that's not very constructive criticism and they stick to it. And they just don't really actually want to have a discussion on like what they find wrong. So like I haven't even heard a legitimate argument if there is an argument, then I'll like look into it. But it's been a very disconnected atmosphere of discussing the show in general, I think. And that could be just because of how the MCU has just been going too.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note a couple things. Like, there are things where superhero fatigue is a thing, right? So after a while, you just don't care about superhero stories and you want to move on to something else, right? And that's valid and that's a thing. And that's usually it's a personal thing, right? What you're going through at the moment. For example, I'm a huge Doctor Who fan. I love Doctor Who.
Yeah, no idea.
Like, I'm a huge Doctor Who fan. But at this point of my life right now, the storytelling on Doctor Who, which I think is great and marvelous or whatever, is not what's really attracting me. I'm more attracted to shows like The Boys that are, you know, a little bit more edgy, or like The Expanse that have a more sci-fi realism. Right. So right now, those are kind of favorites for me. That doesn't mean I don't like Doctor Who. That doesn't mean I'm not, you know, that I stopped being a Doctor Who fan. But currently, in this time of my life, I'm more excited and pumped for shows like The Boys or The Expanse and some of the stuff that really Prime Video is bringing it to me. Like, I don't know, like a lot of their anthology series are really hitting hard with me, and I'm loving what Amazon Studios and Sony have been doing together. But that doesn't mean I don't still enjoy Doctor Who and stuff like that. But I think sometimes for fans, when something's not hitting the same for us as it used to, we're like, oh, it sucks now.
Mm-hmm. It's the extreme language that they use, because it's because there's a lot of The Boys fans that are hating on Miss Marvel, and it's like, you can like both shows. Like, you're allowed, like, I like both shows, you know, like you don't have to like hate, like, just because you like The Boys and like edgy doesn't mean you can't like Miss Marvel. So
and you can also just like something.
Yeah.
And not be, you know, and just be like, oh yeah, I enjoyed that.
It's just been like this argument that like, oh, I like The Boys, so I have a better like critical media analysis, and like, this is why Miss Marvel is bad compared to The Boys. And it's like, you could just separately like The Boys. It didn't have to come in with this discourse. So it's just
most of the arguments that I have heard about not liking something like in the MCU or Miss Marvel usually tend to be a reflection of whatever that person is dealing with at the moment, and not actually about the MCU or Miss Marvel itself. That's just been kind of like, when I really start to talk to people, it tends to be like, well, right now I'm just not feeling these kind of shows. So they kind of generalize and say, oh, this sucked. This is better because this is what I like right now. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that that's a good way to critique things, you know, when we put our own personal, like, you know, likes or dislikes towards it. Yes, that is important, right? Your likes and your dislikes and stuff. But I don't think that that's a reflection of a show.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Because
what I mean, our personal likes are not a reflection of somebody else's show. You know what I mean?
Like, I think that was me with The Boys. I couldn't get back into it because I was like, it's just not the show for me right now. That I'm like, I think, you know, and I'm like, I trust your judgment. I trust that it's good, but I'm like, it's not for me at the moment, you know, and that
doesn't make The Boys a bad show because it wasn't for you at that moment.
Yeah. And it's like,
so I think
I was gonna say, and it's how you like frame talking about it. Like, I also feel like I'm watching The Boys. It is what it is. But I also feel like, okay, the story's a little redundant. It's getting a little like, I feel like I know where it's going for me a bit. So like, I could have argued like, hey, I think The Boys is doing the same thing over and over again too. But like, I chose not to like downplay one project to boost the project I like. I feel like you should be able to do it separately. You should be able to like be able to criticize a project and say what's bad about it without making it a comparison to something else to like downplay that. And I think that's why I didn't like the way the discourse of Miss Marvel was going, was that they were just trying to downplay it in any which way they could, but in almost like a disrespectful way. So,
right. And I think that the rise of absolutely. And I think that the rise of social media, and especially like the TikTok platform, for example, right? It's not like Instagram, for example, where people are just posting their pictures and their captions and look, I'm a fan, right? Twitter is where all kind of like wild fandom stuff is like happening in discourse, but TikTok is a more contained way of looking at like how people react to things, because you have anywhere from a minute to 3 minutes to even 10 minutes on some for some TikTok creators, where they can give you their review in the moment at that spot without any kind of like, critique, or like the way like, I don't know, like a news outlet would have to go through and research and critique and, really think about stuff. People on TikTok can just react from their homes in that moment and say whatever they want to say. And because of popularity, or just because of how they came across your algorithm, for example,
yeah, the algorithm for sure, yeah.
for your page, sometimes, we think, oh, this is the general opinion. Oh, this is what everybody is saying. But a lot of times it's just what's coming up across your algorithm. So it's not necessarily what the wide audience is saying. If you look at Rotten Tomato, the critics' reviews have been really high. And we can argue about the validity of Rotten Tomatoes and things like that. But overall, the reception has been high. Overall, the viewership has been high. So I think overall, Disney Plus is going to look at this, Marvel's going to look at this as a success, right? They're going to be like, people tune, people watch, people enjoy.
And as someone who's like, I've made a video about this as well, because I've had to like talk about the show through many, just because, being a South Asian Muslim creator on Marvel TikTok, and like I've just become more prevalent because of it on TikTok, and I'm more aware of all the commentary. I have heard the Instagram stuff and the Twitter comments, and they're not necessarily positive. But at one point I just decided that like, honestly, all the negative reviews really don't really matter on what I think the show actually is, because I think the show is a success just for existing. I think the show speaks volumes just for being like on Disney Plus, being an MCU project. It has made history in its own way for so many reasons. Not only being a female superhero in the MCU that was standalone, but being a South Asian Muslim female, being good Muslim representation in Western media that has not existed before. I've made several videos about this as well. And the fact that they have addressed so many parts of history, South Asian history, that have never been discussed or in media, like besides one Doctor Who episode. So even if there's a lot of discourse hating, or like, maybe it's just my echo chamber of people liking the show, I don't care, because I think the show still made its point, and I think the show is still powerful because it's almost bigger than the commentary from the fanboys. It's history making. So I think the importance of the show will still remain no matter what. It's how I...
Absolutely.
And I think this is a wonderful point to bring in the idea of representation into our discussion right now, because I think that's a good segue. Is I do want to talk about the representation, because like you said, there was this one episode of Doctor Who that talked about the partition. And that is literally the first time I heard about the partition outside of like a very like glossed over, these were the dates that this happened in a history class. And that means nothing to a kid who's
I don't even think that was in my history class.
Yeah, I think they just,
that gloss over American history, let alone British imperial history.
Yeah.
Right?
But I think that it is so important to have these kind of histories brought up. For example, and Doctor Who has a lot of history because of its time travel elements, right? But as a parent who had a young child who was watching, Doctor Who, there was a time where my son was obsessed with Winston Churchill, and for Christmas asked me for a Winston Churchill book because of an episode of Doctor Who, and he wanted to learn more. Yeah. And I think that that's super important, because how many kids are going to be studying the partition because of things that they heard in Miss Marvel and are like, oh, that's interesting. And they're going to start Googling things, and they're going to start learning, and they might get excited about history in that way because of a superhero show. And I always joke that that same child of mine got through a test on the colonial period in his, high school. I think he was a junior in high school at the time. And he was like, Mom, Assassin's Creed and Hamilton got me through.
That is amazing. That is amazing.
Because this video game, Assassin's Creed, was in that era. And then also, Hamilton and all the revolutionary stuff. He loves Hamilton. And he was able to, just from the songs in Hamilton and playing Assassin's Creed, pass his test. You know what I mean? So I just think that having things like this in television shows are a huge deal, and we don't even know what the impact of this is going to be. We will see the impacts in like 10, 12 years when these kids are like, you know, asking for more and more of these like histories. I think Miss Marvel is extremely important because of that representation. And I keep thinking of that Black Panther line, more connects us than separates us. And throughout watching Miss Marvel, I could not stop thinking about how similar her family was to mine, how similar their histories were to mine, even though we didn't have like a partition per se event like that. But I understood the sorrow of having to leave your home because of fear of violence. I understood the having to go somewhere where you don't speak the language to try to make a better life for your children, to kind of just hope, and the fear of immigrant parents of letting go of their kids because they've lived through so many traumatic events, and their American kids don't understand those like traumatic events because they didn't have to live it,
And just to give my because of my experience and stuff, it's also like, just aside from history, it's also like a huge moment of, I can't really get into like how important the healing was for the generations, but like partition was not just like a moment in history for us, right? Like it was actually like, it's my grandparents' story. The intergenerational trauma has just like existed so prevalently in every aspect of my life. Like it has basically raised me. So I have been very aware of the partition my whole life, but I've never been able to talk about it or address it or tell other people about it or be seen for it. But it has literally shaped me, even though I wasn't involved with it. And I'm sure the next generation after that. So it just, I think the importance of also like having these moments of like traumatic parts of history actually being shown for once, because not many people read books anymore. Our educational system and history classes don't really get into the full scope of everything. And it wouldn't have been in the scope of like what I would have wanted anyway. But these shows are the way we actually can start talking about history and like identifying things that happen. Watchmen brought up the Black Wall Street and that traumatic event. And because of a HBO show, we are now aware of something huge that has happened in our history that we never knew. And now we can address the partition for just to like know that like, oh yeah, like I found out my aunt was a little girl whenever she was just like Sana, and she also got lost too during the partition, during like when she was trying to catch a train. And I haven't been able to talk to my parents about this until they watched that episode. So like, it's not just like 10 years down the line. The healing can start here right now. And it like offers it to a people that like haven't let that happen. And it's because like history kind of did them wrong. Like because history never acknowledged what happened, we just kept moving forward and the trauma just existed within us. And by like the partition finally is very much like the fact that Kamala doesn't know what happened to Aisha and that Muniba doesn't talk to her mom about what happened. That is like literally what it is. And by Kamala talking about it, by her Sana hearing about what happened to her mother, by Muniba realizing like all this was happening, they got stronger. It could build off of it. So it really does like reflect real life. Like we watched it in an MCU show and it was a power origin story, but really it's just all of us are trying to do that as well. So like it was I'm very surprised that they went this route, but it was a huge moment because they went this route, because it is the first time we have an opportunity, like as the South Asian community, to finally talk about something that we don't. And it affects politics till this day. Like it's so prevalent constantly in our story. It's so hard. It's so weird that we haven't talked about it basically, but Miss Marvel allowed it.
And I think that that's why movies like Encanto and shows like Miss Marvel are hitting so hard and so emotionally, because they're hitting parts of people's culture and history that they haven't seen represented ever before on television, in movies. But they don't seem like far away events. They're recent events. They're things that like younger generations are still dealing with. Like you said, it shaped you, you know, even though you weren't alive during that time, it still just shaped who you are now. And that's true for so many different communities and cultures. And I think that people can really connect to that when they watch this Marvel.
Yeah.
I have, you know, no history with the partition or anything like that, but I was sobbing the whole way through that episode 5, because you do really just start to, when you see proper representation, you can empathize with them, you can sympathize with whoever, you know. For how long have we been, you know, sympathizing with straight white men? You know,
the empathy is, you just have to have empathy to like be able to connect to the stories. And so many of our stories, this is like the effort to good representation for everyone, that we all do have. There's a lot of traumatic events in history that have happened. And if this story of colonization and partition was something that you can identify with because of your family history and your community's history, yeah, that makes complete sense, because those stories still need to be told. There's still so much like that needs to be addressed. So the fact that we all could come together and like kind of heal and just address the fact that, yeah, this happened, I see it, that also meant like so much to me, because it was just, it's one thing to go through it, but then like to have other people be like, yeah, no, it was a big deal. Like, because you know how you tell yourself, oh no, whatever, it's just like silly drama or whatever. But like, it's when other people are like, no, it's like a real thing to be upset about. It makes sense that people still have grudges. It's like, it's just a lot of validation, a lot of like connection. And
I do have one gripe about the show that I'm really pissed off about, and I cannot shake it, and I've been thinking about it for days. But that damage control agent that came back to the mosque and did not take her shoes off after she was told once, I was so mad about that.
I'm glad you brought up damage control, because this is a good segue.
I was so upset, girl. I was like, I'm not Muslim, it's not my mosque, whatever, but I was so mad. I was like, and then I was watching it with my significant other, and he was like, at least one of those cops should have been starting to take off his boots or something, right? Yeah. Like, why did nobody do that? They're like, that's so disrespectful. And suddenly, like, and prior to Miss Marvel, I didn't know that. You know what I mean? But after that, I'm just like, how dare you?
That empathy, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And like, this is,
and so that's my one gripe on the show, is like, I wanted to see at least one officer at least be like, should we be taking off our shoes right now? At least, you know what I mean?
I was really nervous about the damage control storyline from like the beginning, but like the finale made me feel a lot better about it. But this is why I don't understand the whole like, oh, Miss Marvel's so basic. Like, they're doing so much in this show that they did the whole South Asian representation, but then they did Muslim representation at the same time, because like the finale spoke volumes with the whole like, this is a mosque in America. There's going to be there's going to be surveillance, and just the shoes, just the fact that this was, people heard Allahu Akbar in like a positive light for the first time that's never existed in Western media. So much was happening, and the way they executed the damage control storyline in the finale was so well done. Like everything that you usually see when it comes to like an FBI story that has to do with like Islamic surveillance, it's usually, you can like, it's very formulatic, and you expect certain tropes to come out. They didn't do any of them. They made it so that it was highlighting the community and highlighting the religion through the story of like being chased. And like, how many times does that happen? It doesn't. So that is why I'm okay with it. Otherwise, I was very nervous about how damage control was going, because it was very much like, oh, it's just reality coming back like over and over again. So it might as well be the boys, because this is what it feels like. But they really stuck the landing with the finale and damage control.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's so many little things that I loved about the finale. One of the things that I love the most is when they're stalling for time, and Nakia's like, don't tell my mom that I have a boyfriend. Or dude, I love it so much, because it just seems so teenager, and just the whole like, your mom's gonna disapprove, that whole thing just like really spoke to me. And on that same note was in that scene where her mom finds out she has powers, and she's more focused on who that other boy was.
That's what it is.
Who's that boy?
Literally,
who's that boy? It's like interdimensional portal, and you're concerned about the boy.
And then line delivery was so good. It was so good.
So those two scenes with Nakia and like, don't tell my mom, even though like obviously it was to stall or whatever, but that just like
her fear was so legit. It was her fear that like, oh my God, she doesn't even care that it's like the FBI or like damage control. She's like, no, I cannot get in trouble. My mother cannot know. Because I even say that like, I don't care if I get in trouble with like, I don't care, arrest me. Just don't tell my mom. Just don't tell my mother. Like she's the one that I'm worried about. But
well, I assume that was just part of the shtick for Nakia. That it was just like, and also playing into maybe their expectations that it's like, oh, you know, we're in a mosque and this girl can't have a boyfriend, you know, and like I can see like Nakia being like, I gotta play that up even more.
Exactly. She definitely used her assets in that moment for sure.
Yeah. But also, what was he doing there?
Yeah, when did he get there?
I don't think he attended. So what was he doing?
They actually are dating, and that was like kind of like the inside joke because I've noticed that he was in the show the whole time, but like it was never really explained why he was there. But he was in the mosque just like studying, so like
and then like in that little like Instagram thing, he was like, she told the world, she declared to the world. So I'm like, how much does Nakia say? Yes, we are, or is it like still on the down low? But
I loved it. There was another scene. Sorry, this popped up in my head right now, and I want to say it before like we move on. But the scene at the end when they're all like on their social media and they're so talking about it, where the auntie was like, she's not going to find a husband now. Like
I heard that the second time around, and I was like, I love you, Ruby. Ruby's stealing every scene that she's in.
Like, she had like 6 lines, but she delivered every time.
I was like, oh man, this show, I don't know, it just hit for me like in so many ways. And one of the things that I want to talk to you guys about too is the representation as far as like the way people look. Now, I felt like Kamala's mom looked just like a real mom. Like, I don't know what it was. She wasn't like this Marissa Tomei, Aunt May kind of mom, right? She looked like a mom to me. And there was something so heartwarming for me about it. Like, I don't know, man, but she felt like a mom. And her dad felt like a dad. And I think that seeing that kind of representation as far as like body image for body image reasons is a big deal. And not to say that she's like a plus size actress or anything like that. She just felt real to me. She didn't seem polished or like made to fit some kind of Hollywood stereotype. She felt real to me. Her dad felt real to me. Like the fact that he didn't have a perfect set of hair and things like that, just I don't know, guys, like it just made me feel really good and it made me feel more connected to the story.
More authentic.
And
story.
More authentic. Yeah. That like that felt real to me. I don't know
how they did it either, because like that her mom looks so much like my mom. Even like I kind of looked like Kamala when I was in high school. So I don't know how they did that. Like I don't know how they accomplished that and got away with it. But it was very impressive. I'm very impressed by how much thought and like attention to detail that they put in the show. They really made sure that like it felt as well represented as it could be. Like they did have some missteps, don't get me wrong. There were some times where just like, why did they do that choice? But for the most part, they put so much thought into everything that they did that it made it for such a great show for that reason. And the representation was definitely how they shine with that.
Agreed.
Absolutely. And so before we branch off into other things. Anything else you want to say about representation, whether it's like the clothing they wore or just the music or anything?
Well,
or the people they cast?
Yeah, there's so much to say about the representation. Like obviously there's a lot to say, but I'm really happy with like the male counterparts of the show. I'm glad that they just existed and they like kind of like Kamala, but they weren't like part of her story. Like they were just like kind of there in her story. And I like that they decided not to like use Kamran to be like, so this is something I noticed that like the MCU always likes to peg the power against each other. Like two people with the same power, they always end up fighting at the end. This is like a running theme since like this Iron Man. This is the first time they didn't do it. Like this was, they were fighting damage control and Kamran and like Kamala were like battling each other, but it was mostly that Kamala was trying to protect damage control while Kamran was doing stuff. So it wasn't even a fight between them. And I just like love that diversion of it's great that they did something different with the MCU storyline, but also just love that they changed Kamran's story from being like, oh, he lost his mother, now he's gonna be a villain, like now into like something else. And I also love that they showed Kamala's character so much, and kind of brings up what the Sheikh Abdullah said earlier to Kamran, which is just like, just because don't make an enemy of you, just because they see a you as an enemy doesn't mean they're yours. And it's basically like Kamala was like actually embodying his exact messages. And I don't know, it's just so well done. Like this show was so good.
And I think this is a perfect time to lead into talking about characters. I do want to talk about Kamran. So I watched it with my child, right? And he's 11, and he was really stressed out towards the end because he was like, is he a villain now? And I was like, no. I was like, he is a 16, 17-year-old boy. He is a little boy who is scared, who just lost his mother and all the family he knows, who is hurting physically because he's in pain, who cannot control his powers, and he's scared and people are coming after him with legal rounds. I was like, he is not a villain. He is a boy who is scared in a shitty situation. And so I feel like I want to argue that, like, and defend him, because I think brown boys do not get defended. They get looked at as adults instead of being looked at as a child, just like Bruno is a child, just like Kamala is a child. And so was Kamran. He is a boy. He's a little boy, not a little boy, but, you know, he's a young boy who was scared and just reacting. So I think that's important to note that. And I really did like that when they showed, like, you know, his end story, his resolution, how it ended. It was through talking it out.
That was a good moment.
You know, she puts them in a bubble, and as soon as he starts calming down, all those weird things that he was shooting out with his power start to disappear because he's calming down his emotions. Like he was given the opportunity to calm down. Where in a lot of like these scenarios, it's like, oh, they're going to shoot you to take you down, and nobody wants to talk it out. And I really love that was resolved through talking it out.
Because he hasn't, you know, he hasn't had the chance to process literally anything about having his powers, about being alone, about losing his mother. Like, he needed, you know, Kamala's like grace, so to speak, to give him that space to process, to, you know, because I was surprised how much I ended up loving Kamran through this. Because in the comics, he's not a great person, and then he disappears. And so it was always suspicious. And it's almost like your son, where it was like, so is he going to be like a full villain now? Like, are we going that route? Because I was really starting to like him. And so I loved that. Again, like, I'm a sucker when a superhero doesn't use their superpowers to like save the day, but like she literally just creates a protective shield, and that's what, you know, Cap would be so proud. But, you know, and she does that just to give the moment of like talking it out. That it was one of those, I'm like, I want to see where Kamran goes next and where him and Kareem go next. That I think Kamala's other superpower is all of her love interests becoming friends with each other.
Right.
Because I love that, like,
that Bruno
Kamran and Bruno are like suddenly like, oh, okay, we can be friends now. Weird. Okay, I can roll with it. But and just going off just his story with him.
Just going off like what you said, that like there's just not that much. Brown boys just letting themselves have feelings is just not something that there's space for. Is so true, and that is why I'm so happy that they decided to make that choice with Kamran, because I believe the comics kind of make him into more of a radical character. But like it's there's a reason, unfortunately, for the fact that like brown boys cannot just exist in these spaces and have that time to like emote and process. And it comes from the scene earlier where as soon as they enter the mosque, they're like, every male 16 to 25, show me your ID. It's because like at a young age, brown boys are targeted and considered the villain. So like it's not even just the fact that like he's going through a lot. He's also just been expected to be the villain from the beginning. And I'm really happy that they didn't make.
He's been set up to fail.
Exactly. So I'm really happy that they gave the opportunity for him not to do that, because I've always felt like media is supposed to be escapism, right? Like that's why we watch TV, so we can go to these like faraway universes. And like the last thing you want is to like see your reality actually just kind of keep happening. Like anyone should be able to like escape through TV. no matter how you look. So I'm happy that they were given that opportunity to escape from like their own expectations from reality and how people treat them here.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just really when I want to touch on like some of the other stereotypes. I really loved that Bruno was not the one she was pining over. I think we discussed that, in the last episode. But also he's a worthy, like, mate if it did happen in the future, and I wouldn't be upset about that because their friendship, it would be very easy to believe that their friendship led to a more romantic, relationship in the future.
They clearly love each other.
Yeah.
There is love there. But,
the friendship
is so and that can be the foundation.
Yeah, sorry, I said their friendship is so good and so strong too. Like it's such a backbone to their story, basically.
Yeah, and that can be the foundation for a beautiful, blossoming romantic relationship later. So I wouldn't be upset about
children.
Yeah, they're still teenagers.
Yeah, they're also children, right?
I always feel weird when it's like, let's decide like endgame shipping. I'm like, but they're children.
Yeah.
What if they go to college?
And they need to go to college before they decide.
Exactly.
And I'm very excited about these younger characters that we're getting in the MCU. Spoilers for, did you guys watch Thor?
I did not see Thor yet.
Okay, then I won't mention it. But I do love younger characters in general. I think that's why Ghostbuster Afterlife appealed to me so much, because Ghostbusters Afterlife revolved around the kids' storyline. And I love Tom Holland's Spider-Man. He's young, and I loved his whole team, like Zendaya and Ned. And, I loved all of those characters. And I love Kate Bishop and Yelena, even though they're adults, but they're on the much younger end, and I am just loving this idea of, Captain America, Sam Wilson, having to deal with nothing but like teenage ground level superheroes.
Think about that, yeah.
I just can't wait.
That just makes me want it more, Monica.
Yeah, I hope. Oh my God.
We know he's good with kids, he's good with his nephews, but all I want now is him and Bucky trying to co-parent a bunch of young adults.
God, that is a series right there. That is what we need.
All I want.
Yeah. Oh my God.
And this is 22 episodes. And the fact that they're all so young sets them up for another 10 years at least, until we get another big like endgame level crossover somewhere down the line, right? I don't need that today. Like, I am here for the long haul, and the fact that they're teenagers now and they'll be in their like 20s, early 30s maybe, in 10 years. Like, I'm here for the long haul, Marvel. Like, I'm glad that you're investing in younger kids that grow with.
Sure, yeah.
And I think this is why Stranger Things appealed to me too, because it started with these children, and then you've seen them grow over the years, and I'm ready to see this cast of new MCU characters grow. Like, I'm excited to see where they go. Like, who will Imani be like? If she's acting her butt off now in this series, imagine her with like 10 years worth of training and like experience. I'm so hyped for the future. And I know that a lot of people out there in the fandom maybe feel disconnected, or maybe it's just too much. Like, it's too many properties and they feel like they can't keep up with everything. And it was simpler when it was one movie a year or whatever. And I get it. I sympathize with those fans who just feel that I get it. But I am hyped, man. I am ready for the next, installment. And anyways, anything on characters before we move on to just overall storyline?
Not quite, but I do want to pick up where you were just talking about, maybe having that disconnect, but it's where it's feeling too big. And I've said this before, I think on the podcast, or certainly with you, Monica, about like Star Wars. It's, again, like these are two giant Disney IPs right now, Star Wars and Marvel, but it's big enough that there is something for everyone. And like, you're maybe not necessarily expected to try to consume everything. I haven't in the MCU. I haven't seen Iron Man. Don't hate me. But it's like, it's one of those, you can jump in if you want to or not. You will find something that will resonate with you, and that's okay. Or you might not. And again, that's okay. So, I think, and then thinking of where it's going, I just hope that means, especially for representation, there is going to be more people that see themselves in that and see themselves as heroes. And again, I just hope like, next 10, 20 years, wherever these go, that becomes the norm for them. Mm-hmm. So that's on that note, I wanted to, before we move on.
Yeah, I agree with that. Because like, it's kind of like what I said before, that like Ms. Marvel is already successful just because it exists. Like the MCU is definitely taking chances with Phase 4. They're doing different stories and giving more like of a, just like a chance for other stories to exist. And I'm just proud of them for doing that. Like maybe this is building up to something great, which I do believe it is building up to something great. But it's just, they're taking a risk and trying out different, a younger audience, trying out different stories, just different styles even, and playing with the multiverse. I'm just proud of them for like experimenting. Because like if we had the same old Phase 1 kind of like method again right now, I'd be bored a bit. Like I'd be like, okay, like they're taking it further.
We've seen this.
Yeah.
And I think too, I'm okay with the separation of universes. Like I had no problem with the Netflix Marvel shows not connecting to the larger MCU because they were like these separate things that did not connect. Suddenly now they're connecting because they found a way to make it work, right? But I was totally okay with, Jessica Jones and Daredevil being its own thing. And I loved it. And I had no problem with that. I know that in like a perfect magical world, everything would connect and interweb, but I'm okay when they don't. Like it's all right with me. And I like that
the comics is,
yeah,
right?
Like that's
having the budget to do whatever.
Yeah, that's the nature of
whatever.
But,
you don't have to worry about scheduling and actors and availability.
And I do like having like a Moon Knight. I thought was a little bit darker and a little bit like deeper of a show, right? Like it was a little more kind of traumatizing in some ways, So it was total different tone than WandaVision, than Loki, than Miss Marvel. And Miss Marvel's a completely different tone than all the other ones. I'm okay with that. Like for me, things don't have to stay the same cookie cutter kind of thing. And they don't have to coexist. Like anyway, I'm okay with separate stories. The way I was okay with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. being separate and, Agent Carter, her show being separate. Like those were all okay for me. Like I didn't have a problem with
I feel like there is like a split in the fandom with that. Like some of us are really okay with that and are happy with it, and then some of us just aren't. So I don't know. I feel like there's just a divide, unfortunately, because of that.
Yeah.
And
even what you're
sorry, go ahead.
Well, even what you were saying, Monica, about like the tones being different across some of the shows, that again gives the opportunity for representation across directors and writers and producers, that they're bringing a different flavor to it. That again, we don't want every movie that later comes out to all feel the same, because then you get that predictability, right? Like I want, I think again, when we had like Thor Ragnarok, it was such a tonal shift. And it worked because it was like a new director coming in and kind of like playing with it in a different way. Taika, do whatever. But I think I think that's important too. Like this is what I also hope, not just with on-camera representation, that we follow through and continue to see people of color, women of color getting these high blockbuster films and getting these director tags and these writer tags. Like that does need to happen.
And we have the space for it.
And they're for sure.
Just because we're getting all this representation doesn't mean we won't get, white male centered stories anymore. You know what I mean? Like the space is there. They can all coexist.
Yeah, just like real life.
Just like real life. Yeah. And I love it. And I do want to talk about the story because, gosh, I can't believe we're like an hour in already.
Yeah, gosh, so much to say. Yeah.
But I do want to talk about the storyline overall. I was very surprised to see that who the actual... I don't know if there was a villain per se in this story. I think it really felt to me more of like just the story of how she became Miss Marvel and how she got her powers. And I didn't really feel like there was one overall villain. I felt like she had a lot of antagonists and things she had to deal with to get to the end scene. So I don't know how you felt about the overall storylines. Like, I guess, give me your takes.
Yeah, I guess it was more of like coming of age and like coming to her own. That was like more of the focus. There were like villains, like Najma was there, but I don't think she was like the central one. I guess Damage Control would have been the villain, but I do think it was more focused on like her development and her growth and like her coming of age story more so.
Yeah. I think like, because you do have like the two main antagonists, and I think it was kind of interesting the way that it was, one was very global, world-ending high stakes, right, with Najma and the clandestines and everything, and that wraps up in episode 5 for the most part. But it's the Damage Control thread is local, it is closer to home, but of course it has its own repercussions. Like, what does this mean for any, quote, enhanced individual across the country? What are other countries doing? Is there some sort of global threat? And so I think that was kind of interesting. I kind of liked having the two different threats, so to speak, like on two very different scales. One could tear the world apart, but the other could tear the societal world apart in the sense that it is so close to home. It is like, they are trying to catch one boy, one boy who's on the run and who is scared, and there's no due process, no legality, probably. And so I think I kind of enjoyed seeing that space and having Kamala having to kind of balance that with, of course, her own day-to-day struggle. But I think especially when you're in like that liminal teenage space, it's where are you within the context of your own home as you're also starting to think of all of the impacts beyond that, beyond your community, beyond your country, beyond the world, and I think having that balance within Kamala's story, I think kind of made sense.
And they did it
as well as how it reverberates through history, like that whole connection.
Yeah. I was gonna say they were able to use like the villains and antagonists to be good representation and help her story too. Like the Najma storyline really like laid the foundation of her going and connecting to Aisha and like learning about herself. The Damage Control storyline definitely helped representation with the Muslim community. So like they were able to use the antagonists in a way that like almost like solidified the main story, which was just showing all the parts of Kamala Khan, her identity, her community, and her history, and like what it took for her to be like the completely developed character that she was. So,
because in some ways, I think the damage, like what you said about like getting her her history with the clandestines and everything, and her mother, and learning about her grandmother or great grandmother. But it was Damage Control that I think almost in that final episode solidified her as a superhero within her own right. Not as Kamala Khan, but as a superhero within her own right, which I think because it's her community that is rallying with her.
Yeah.
Which I think was...
She's like the neighborhood... like the neighborhood Spider-Man, but neighborhood Miss Marvel.
Yes. Yeah. I love it. Yeah.
I really loved how even the police officers were defending their superhero, right, against Damage Control, because they were like, no, this is our hero. And like, I really loved the whole community vibe coming to rally. And probably everybody knows her secret identity, right? But they're like, whatever, we're not going to tell. Yeah. It's like that scene where everybody sees Spider-Man's face on the train or whatever. Yeah. They're like, he's just a kid. They're like, nah, this is our hero. We got you.
And you get the sense with them, like someone who would see her, they'd be like, oh yeah, you're Kamala. Like, oh, okay, good for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think there's something to be said, and maybe I don't know what it is that it should be said, but I think it's important to note that sometimes world-ending events can feel just as stressful for a superhero as a small, like, them being after Kamran and dealing with like a more street-level thing. If you're in that moment, in that situation, like if you're the superhero, like both things could be just as important, right? Small communities matter, world events matter, right? So like, I think that, I don't know, something can be said about that as well. And then also it's really interesting how some of the gripes that I've heard about the MCU and the way that things are written out are complaints about like, oh, nobody's talking about the Eternals. In Moon Knight, they didn't even mention any of these other things. And I think it's interesting that like in our own communities, we have enough going on that we like in real life, we understand that there's a war in Ukraine right now. We understand that there's civil rights being like, trampled upon in our own nation, in other nations, and there's so much going on in the world that it's very possible that, in Miss Marvel, they didn't mention the Celestial in the middle of the oceans from Eternals.
Yeah, that's my point. Mm-hmm.
I think that that one, I'm okay with them not tying everything in and explaining it and bringing it up. And I'm okay with them throwing in nods to like little things in the MCU as well. But I think that this episode, at least the final episode, really showed us that like big, huge world ending events and small little community events feel just as like important and center of the story. And especially in our own worlds, right? Whatever we're dealing with is like the anxiety that we're having. And, they're the same to me, and it's easy for heroes to see. I don't know where I'm going with that.
I agree because anyway. Like especially with like a coming of age story, I think both world ending or small events, they both affect the character. They both like have an impact on like how the character handles it, especially if it's like something close to home. Like if she lost Bruno, that would have been a big setback for her. So like, and when you compare it to Spider-Man, like I think Spider-Man 2 is so strong because of like all the stuff that's happening in the community. So it's just those things really do help with character development. And I think it works so well with the story and developing her character too. So I think it worked perfectly for the story that they were going for, all the choices that they made.
All right. And so then the other, probably the last thing that I want to talk about, well, it's not the last thing, but it's the last thing we probably have time for today, is I guess the larger MCU stories. How do you think that Miss Marvel fits in compared to everything else? How do you think it'll be in the future? Like, what are your expectations, hopes, or thoughts on Miss Marvel as part of the MCU now?
Well,
I want her to have everything.
Yeah. I mean, the end credit scene, which I thought of you guys right away because we were talking about how cool it would be if Brie Larson came for the end credit scene, just made me so happy because I was just like, yes, it's established. It's there. She's connected to Brie. Like she's already on another adventure. Like, so I think I want a season 2, but I also like love that she's already part of the Marvel's plot point, whatever they're going for. So I'm happy with it. And I think there's a lot of connections to the MCU that will eventually come through. Like, where they found the bracelet was around the 10 rings. There's this like scroll arm. There's, I don't know, there's like connections to the other parts of the MCU somehow. So now they have a Miss Marvel the Marvel's connection. So I do see her being involved in a lot of projects if they let her happen.
And like, like we kind of mentioned earlier, like almost setting up like a younger Avengers sort of thing, a new Avengers team at some point down the road. That seems to be where that's building to. Do I have any idea of what the Marvel's plot could be? Absolutely not. I'm not familiar enough with the comics to even try to like tease that out or think more. But I'm hoping in the sense that because of that end credits where it seems like they've swapped places, and Carol is confused and concerned in some way. I'm hoping that the Marvels will kind of hold true to the name of the film and that really give equal weight to, and make it really like, 3 main characters. I don't want it to just be like the Carol show and Monica and Kamala are kind of in it too. Like I really
like the sidekick.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I really want them to be elevated, and I'm really curious about how Kamala will be working with her idol.
I know,
or working with my sister brought up a great point, and with Monica there and being involved with Sword. Like, what is that? Is she gonna how is that like feeling going to be like?
I have a theory.
So I'm kind of curious.
So you know how like Monica and Carol seem to have like a disconnect after like, you know, like she kind of abandoned her whenever she was a child, and or like when she lost her mother. I do see like a lot of like parallels between what Muniba, Auntie, and Sana went through. So I feel like, you know how like Kamala had to bring them together. I feel like Kamala could bring Monica and Carol together. That like because of like trying to like mentor this girl and like try to help her wherever she is.
I want that.
Yeah, right. It'd be so cute if they do that. Yeah,
I do. You know, this show is really getting me excited about kind of like the separation of things, right? So, for example, Moon Knight is dealing with these ancestral planes and these otherworldly planes, other dimensions, you know, Multiverse of Madness ties into that, other dimensions, other things, you know, the way that like all of that was handled, right? All these other dimensions and worlds. So I kind of like this fork where like some of the MCU storylines are going that way. And then we have the God realms where we have Thor and the Eternals, and maybe even a little bit with Shang-Chi, right? I mean, I know that's another dimension, but he also is dealing with like godlike powers and things like that. So, you know, I'm interested to see like where the whole Thor gods and Eternals route goes. You know, we're getting our Harry Styles in the MCU now, and like, you know, where does he fit into all this? But I'm also excited about the
a new band.
Yeah. I'm also excited about the street level stuff, right? So now we have Spider-Man, who's in Brooklyn on his own somewhere, you know, like out there kind of just Peter Parkering it up. Where is he going to meet, you know, Kamala, who's just really kind of close, you know, in Jersey or whatever. Yeah. And then we have She-Hulk coming, you know, we have all these kind of like very East Coast driven things happening. Sword ended up in Jersey at one point, right? Because with the whole like
he was in Jersey too.
Oh,
it
was
in
Jersey, right? Good point.
So like it's
everything is legal in New Jersey.
Everything is kind of like, I'm very excited about this whole New York, Jersey, like East Coast thing that is happening, and the superhero like team that is building around that. Because I think even the Avengers campus was in New York. And so I'm very excited about all these, like the way that it's all forking out and how everybody's going to end up on its own. And especially with like the Marvels. Oh, I just love that name so much. I'm excited about all that. But really, I think that this season really showed Miss Marvel is full on Avenger level capable. She can be an Avenger. She can, you know, she can protect her city the way Spider-Man protects his neighborhood and everything. And she can protect the world the way an Avenger could, because she saved the world, really, you know. In one season, she saved her neighborhood and the world. So I don't know.
And then, it's exactly what her dad says at the end. When you save one person, you save the world. And that speaks to Kamala and her story so well throughout it.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, before we wrap up, anything else you guys want to mention that maybe we hadn't talked about?
She might be a mutant. That whole storyline thing. That throwing that out there. I don't know what they're going to do with that, but like that was an interesting, like, I guess Easter egg, but it was an interesting twist of who knows what they're going to do with that.
I didn't pick up. I think Monica, you had told me that it was like the X-Men theme or something.
It sounded to me like the 97, like the animated.
The same thing. I did not make that connection, but it's one of those, you don't use the word mutation in a Marvel, like in a superhero show without a particular reason. And there was enough of a beat that it was like a little on the nose, where it was like, you know, the writers and producers were like, you did catch that, right? Like,
it was like, it was really short, but if you wanted to hear it, you heard it. Like, I remember I screamed and like rewind and had to hear it again.
It was like, we're going to make sure you catch this.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and they give her a moment too, where she doesn't say anything and she's like processing it, and I think it's like a moment as fans.
For sure.
Exactly. She was like, a label's a label, you know, like. Oh, it was great. I'm excited for that. If that's the case, like, yeah, bring them on.
Yeah,
Like, that's cool.
I have no
Let's see
thoughts.
how
I have
it
no
goes.
thoughts. I'm just like, okay, they did that. We'll see what they do with it. So we'll go from there.
I mean, I'm a big X-Men fan.
Same.
As far as like, I love all the X-Men franchise films. I used to read the Wolverine comics as a kid. I love the X-Men animated show. So in that sense, I'm excited to bring them on. Like,
and I think it's.
let me see what.
I think it'll like not be a hindrance. Like I don't think she'll like. I think she can still be a standalone character and like still be immune and like be strong in the MCU. Like I think it'll be. I don't think it'll affect her too much, but at the same time, it could affect the MCU in a cool way. So.
Yeah. I think it's definitely setting up for introducing that within the current MCU.
I'm hyped.
Yeah, they did so much. They did a lot of great things with this series.
Yeah, they packed a lot in, and I think they're really delivered.
All right, guys. Well, thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. You know, we've been talking for an hour and 20 minutes, and it does not feel like we even like covered anything. I feel like there's so much more we could go into. We didn't even talk about Zoe.
Oh, yeah.
Like I could talk a lot about Zoe and stuff, but I just, oh man, we might have to do a second episode. I don't know. So.
There is so much to talk about, so we could definitely do it.
There's so much to talk about. It just, you know, a lot. So for those of you tuning in, you know, and hearing us gush about Ms. Marvel, I hope that we were able to provide some insight as to like why we are really connected to this show. I want to thank you guys again for coming on and talking with me. This is going to wrap up this episode of the Temple of Geek podcast. We want to thank everyone who tuned in and especially our guests for being with us today. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to hit us up on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok by using the handle Temple of Geek. Do you want to check out some of our other episodes or shows? Why don't you head on over to templeofgeek.com. There you will find all sorts of content that pertain to the world of geek.